The moment she opened her window, I knew my life was about to change. I had spent weeks hiding behind the curtains of my apartment, watching the world from a safe distance, and somehow she had noticed me. But what terrified me most wasn't that she'd caught me looking. It was the sadness in her eyes when she did. She didn't look angry. She didn't look offended. She looked like someone who understood what it meant to be lonely. And then she opened the window wider and spoke first. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know when a simple story might remind someone that they are not as alone as they think. My name is Daniel, and at 34, I had become an expert at disappearing. Not physically, exactly. I still went to work, bought groceries, paid my rent, and nodded politely when someone asked how I was doing. But emotionally, I had vanished. 2 years earlier, I had lost my wife in a sudden accident, and the grief had changed the shape of my entire life. The apartment we had once filled with music, arguments over dinner, and ridiculous laughter had become painfully quiet. I kept her favorite mug in the same place because moving it felt like admitting she wasn't coming back. I stopped inviting friends over because I didn't know how to explain the emptiness. Eventually, people stopped asking. Then, 3 months before the story began, a new tenant moved into the building across from mine. She lived in the apartment directly opposite my bedroom window, close enough that I could see the warm glow of her lamps at night but far enough that we had never properly met. Her name, I later learned, was Emma. At first, she was simply another person in the neighborhood. I noticed her carrying boxes, struggling with a stubborn suitcase, laughing on the phone while balancing a grocery bag against her hip. She seemed energetic in a way I had forgotten how to be. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something else. She always closed her curtains before sunset. She rarely had visitors. And sometimes, late at night, I would see her sitting beside the window without turning on the lights. It reminded me of myself. Maybe that's why I began watching. Not in the way a person watches someone they desire, but in the strange, quiet way lonely people recognize loneliness in others. Sometimes I would sit by my window with a cup of tea and see her reading. Other nights she would water a small plant on her windowsill. Once, during a thunderstorm, I saw her standing perfectly still with her forehead against the glass. I never imagined she noticed me too. Then came the night that changed everything. I had returned from work exhausted after another terrible day. My manager had asked whether I was ever going to move on with my life, and the words had followed me home like a shadow. I heated leftover food, didn't eat it, and sat beside my bedroom window. Across the narrow street, Emma was moving around her room. The curtains were partly closed, and I could only see shadows. Then she stepped toward the window to change clothes. The moment I realized what was happening, I looked away. I immediately felt ashamed. I stood up, turned toward my kitchen, and told myself I would never sit by that window again. But before I could walk away, her curtains stopped moving. She had seen me. My stomach dropped. I expected her to slam the curtains shut. Instead, she walked toward the window, opened it, and looked directly at me. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she said something I couldn't hear through the glass. She gestured toward my window. I opened it. She repeated herself, louder this time, asking if I was okay. I didn't know what to say. Of all the things she could have asked, that was the one question I wasn't prepared for. I told her I was sorry and explained that I hadn't meant to stare. I told her I had realized what was happening and immediately looked away. I expected anger. Instead, she smiled faintly. She told me she knew. Then she said something that stayed with me for years. She said that sometimes people look through windows because they don't know how to knock on doors. I couldn't answer. She told me her name was Emma. I told her mine was Daniel. And after that first awkward conversation, she closed the window. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Emma was standing in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee. She said she had figured out which apartment was mine because of the window. I laughed for the first time in days. She didn't come inside. She simply handed me one of the cups and said she thought I looked like someone who needed coffee more than she did. That became the beginning. Not romance. Not immediately. Friendship. A fragile, unexpected friendship between 2 people who had both learned how to hide. Over the next few weeks, we began talking from our windows. Sometimes for 5 minutes. Sometimes for an hour. She told me she had moved to the city after leaving a difficult relationship. She had spent years being told that she wasn't good enough, wasn't attractive enough, wasn't successful enough. Eventually, she had started believing those things. I told her about my wife. For the first time since the accident, I said her name out loud without feeling like my chest was being crushed. Emma listened. She didn't tell me to move on. She didn't say everything happened for a reason. She simply listened. Then one evening, she asked me why I still kept my curtains closed so much. I told her the truth. Because when the curtains were closed, nobody could see that I was hurting. She looked at me for a long moment and said that hiding pain doesn't make it disappear. It only makes the room smaller. Those words followed me everywhere. Slowly, things began changing. I started eating at the table instead of standing in the kitchen. I opened the curtains in the morning. I cleaned the spare room that I had been using as storage. I even invited an old friend over for dinner. Emma noticed every little improvement. Then one Saturday morning, I heard loud banging from across the street. I looked outside and saw her struggling with a bookshelf. I crossed the street and offered to help. She hesitated. Then she smiled and said yes. That afternoon, we assembled furniture, burned our fingers on hot coffee, laughed at instructions neither of us understood, and discovered that the bookshelf was missing 2 screws. It was ordinary. And somehow, it was beautiful. But just when life seemed to be becoming lighter, Emma disappeared. Her curtain stayed closed for 3 days. I sent her a message. No response. I knocked on her door. Nothing. On the 4th day, I became worried and asked the building manager if he knew whether she was okay. He told me she had received bad news from home. Her mother was seriously ill. Emma had flown out that morning. I returned to my apartment and sat by the window. For the first time, I understood how frightening it was to care about someone. I had spent years avoiding attachment because I believed losing people was the worst pain imaginable. Now I realized there was another kind of pain. Wondering whether someone you care about is hurting somewhere far away and knowing you can't fix it. Weeks passed. Then, one rainy evening, I heard a knock. When I opened the door, Emma stood there soaked from the rain, exhausted, holding a small suitcase. Her mother had survived the worst of the illness, but Emma had spent weeks beside her hospital bed. She apologized for disappearing. I told her she didn't need to. Then she looked past me into my apartment. The curtains were open. The place was cleaner. There were photographs on the walls again. And on the table sat my wife's old mug. Emma smiled. She said she could tell I had finally started living again. I told her she had something to do with that. She shook her head. She said I had done the work myself. But I knew the truth. Sometimes people don't save us by doing something extraordinary. Sometimes they save us by noticing. By asking if we're okay. By sitting beside us when we don't know what to say. By reminding us that grief doesn't mean life is over. Months later, Emma and I sat beside our windows again. But this time, neither of us was hiding. The curtains were completely open. She told me that when she first saw me staring from my window, she had been angry for only a second. Then she realized there was something familiar in my expression. Loneliness. She said she had opened her window because she didn't want either of us to spend another night pretending we were invisible. I smiled and told her that one small window had changed everything. She laughed and said maybe it wasn't the window. Maybe it was the fact that someone finally chose to open it. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may need a little hope today, and subscribe. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can reach someone at the exact moment they are ready to give up. And before the story ends, I want you to leave a comment telling me this: have you ever had someone enter your life at the exact moment you needed them most? As for me, I never closed those curtains again. Not because I wanted to watch the world. Because I finally wanted to be part of it. And every evening, when the sunlight disappeared behind the buildings, Emma and I would leave our windows open. Not because we needed to speak. But because now we knew that somewhere across the street, someone was there. Someone who noticed. Someone who cared. And sometimes, that is all a lonely heart needs to begin healing.